In life, there are winners and losers, but in Blizzard's world, we're all just losers. While every build in the game is now significantly worse than it was before the patch, there's actually still some good stuff going on for Necromancer, specifically for our Minion build. Minions receive several significant buffs that make our early game, mid game, and late game all significantly cleaner, having way more damage and way more survivability on our minions. We also got several Malignant Hearts, which is the seasonal mechanic that substantially increased the damage and survivability of this build. In fact, with all of these changes, I would go so far as to claim that Minions is now our best leveling, mid-game, and early late-game progression build, and I think there's actually a decent chance it could be very powerful in the late game. To show you how powerful this build is, especially in the early game, I cleared a level 45 dungeon when I was only level 28. I actually cleared this dungeon when I was level 25 as well, but I didn't record the footage. Before we dive into the build, we're first going to cover the patch notes and talk about exactly what changed that made this build so powerful. Most of what made the build better were these number changes, but there were some very important quality of life changes that actually make a big difference. The first one is that our golem now moves faster and moves unhindered through enemies while we activate their cooldown. Oftentimes before, our golem would get stuck on walls and stuck on random stuff, couldn't get through minions, but now every time you activate the golem, it goes off. We also have a much bigger area for targeting corpses with our corpse tendrils and raised skeletons. This might not sound like a big deal, but before you had to click pretty much exactly on where the corpses were, but now we can kind of be in the general range, which makes this build so much better and easier to play. Another change that affects this build at all stages of the game is the buff to the Skeletal Priest. Before, it only gave 20% damage and 10% healing, but now it's giving 30% damage and 15% healing. This is going to make the build much easier to play in the early game because of the increased tankiness and damage, and in the late game, the increased damage is a very big deal. The Skeletal Mage buff also has a big part to play in why this build is so much stronger in the early game and late game. Our Skeletal Mages now double attack every 4 attacks instead of every 5 attacks, which is quite a bit of damage. Our Iron Golem Slam also now happens every 4 attacks instead of every 5. You don't typically play this, but as we're going to get into later, you might actually start playing this ability because we have much better uptime on Vulnerable than we had before the patch. The final major buff comes in the form of a mid-game buff, where our Cold Mages now cast Blizzards every 8 seconds instead of every 10 seconds. This represents a 20% increase in Blizzards, and if you've played this game in the mid-game, you know that vast majority of your damage is actually coming from Blizzards, so it's effectively a 20% damage increase in the mid-game. This build has been buffed in so many ways. You can start to see how much better this build is now when you look at all these quality of life changes, tankiness changes, damage changes, and the crazy thing is they've really hit this build at every stage of the game. I really just think that minions are very strong now, and I'm definitely planning on playing them for a long time. Let's dive into the build and really talk about what makes this build tick. We're specifically going to be focused on the early game and the mid game, pretty much from levels 1 to 75 is the range I'm targeting. For our basic skill, we're going to be running Reap. This is for the damage reduction, the attack speed whenever we kill an enemy, but most importantly, it's for the free corpse that we get every 4 seconds. This will allow us to just walk up to a pack, cast Reap, and then Corpse Tendrils on the corpse that it spawns and group up enemies to quickly burst them down. In our core skills, we're going to be running Hewed Flesh. This will give us extra corpses to work with for casting Skeleton Priest and for refreshing our minion count. In our Corpse and Macabre skills, we're going to be putting 1 point into Grim Harvest just to get access to Fueled by Death, which we're going to be putting 3 points into. This will give us a 9% damage multiplier every time we consume a corpse, which counts for summoning our skeletons. We're also going to be putting 3 points into Skeletal Warrior Mastery, which will increase the damage and tankiness of our Skeletal Warriors by 45%. In our Curse skills, we're going to be putting 3 points into Death's Embrace, and 3 points into Death's Reach. So the way that these work is they're actually based on where your minions are, not based on where you are. So Death's Embrace will give your minions 6% damage against enemies who are close to them, and then they'll take 9% damage reduction from enemies who are close to them. And then Death's Reach will mostly target our mages and just give them 12% damage. We're also going to be putting 3 points into Amplify Damage. This was also just buffed. So instead of it giving 9% damage against cursed enemies, it's now giving 12%, which is actually quite a bit. And we're going to be putting 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery, which will buff our damage and tankiness of our mages by 60%. And then we're going to be putting 3 points into Decrepify. This is just because we really have extra points and we don't have a lot of stuff to spend them on, so we just spend them for extra tankiness and damage reduction. And then really importantly, we're going to be taking Abhorrent Decrepify. which will cause specifically our Reapers and our active on our Golem to reduce all of our cooldowns. It's also going to cause our Scythe to reduce our cooldowns and Corpse Tendrils. So it's quite a few things that are hitting this, and basically it's going to massively increase the uptime on our Bone Storm and Corpse Tendrils. So Decrepify, we're going to talk about more in a minute when we talk about the new heart mechanic. This actually is a really big deal. We're going to get into that after the skill tree though. Next, we're going to be putting points into Corpse Tendrils. I put 1 point in, and then I get 4 points to Corpse Tendrils from my boots to get us to 5 points. The reason we want to get to 5 points is because this skill is actually soft capped with regards to its cooldown reduction at 5 points. You'll still get cooldown reduction for additional points, but it's way less. We're also going to be taking, very importantly, Plagued Corpse Tendrils, which is going to cause our Corpse Tendrils to apply Vulnerable. This is a huge deal. We're putting 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit. This will mean that every time we cast the Scythe, we'll get 15% movement speed, which is quite a bit. And then we're putting 3 points into Necrotic Carapace. This is because whenever our minions spawn corpses, which our Reapers are doing all the time, we get 6% of our base life as Fortify. This will permanently keep us Fortify capped. Quite a bit of free tankiness. We're going to be moving on to the ultimate skills. We're going to be putting 3 points to Golem Mastery for 75% damage reduction and 75% damage on our Golem. And then we're going to be taking 3 points into Bonded in Essence. This is where the bulk of our healing for our minions come from. It'll cause our priest to also heal our minions for 60% of their maximum life. We're also going to be putting 3 points into Aspiring Leader, which will give us and our minions 12% attack speed. We're actually mostly running this to give us the 12% attack speed for proccing Lucky Hit when we're talking about late game, but in the early game, the 12% attack speed is a big damage increase for our minions. We're going to be putting 3 points into Hellbent Commander, which is just going to give our minions 30% increased damage when we're close to them. And then 3 points into Death's Defiance, which is going to make it so whenever our minions get hit, they can never take more than 30% of their maximum life and damage. This is really nice. It improves our tankiness by quite a bit for our minions. Finally, we're going to be taking Bone Storm. We're going to be taking all of the passives. So Bone Storm we're going to get into more in a second, but basically Bone Storm is going to give us a ton of tankiness and a little bit of damage. It's also going to massively increase the uptime on some very important damaging aspects, as well as some very important tankiness aspects. Like I said, we're going to cover that very soon. First though, Shadow Blight. This is kind of a cornerstone of the build here, and with the recent change, Shadow Mages now apply Shadow Blight and ramp it up. And so we're able to constantly proc this Shadow Blight, which is just giving us a flat 10% damage. But when we get into the aspects, you'll see this is actually much stronger than it first appears. Before we can talk about what you're going to be building towards in the mid and late game, we first need to talk about the very early game with regards to aspects and what aspects you can get that are high value from the Codex of Power. In particular, there's 2 very strong offensive aspects you're going to look for, which is the aspect of Reanimation and the Blighted aspect. And then defensively, you're going to be looking for the aspect of Disobedience and the aspect of Might. Your 2 offensive aspects you should probably look to put on your rings. This is because you're definitely going to be wanting to wield a 2-handed weapon while you're progressing through the early game because it will massively increase the damage of your minions. Disobedience, I'd recommend that you put it on your amulet for the bonus tankiness, and then the aspect of Might, I would suggest Pants. Now let's start talking about the aspects that you're going to be looking for as you progress through the mid game and towards the late game. Keep in mind, this is a very offensive setup, and the exact slots that aspects will go on will vary depending on your exact setup. The Coldbringers aspect is the aspect that really represents the end of the early game and the beginning of the mid game for this build. It will cause you to switch from Shadow Mages to Cold Mages, and then your Cold Mages will constantly cast Blizzards that do significant AoE damage. This was just buffed, and instead of it being every 10 seconds, it's now every 8 seconds, so this is now significantly better than it was before. On our chest, we're going to be running the Bled Getters aspect, and this will increase our maximum number of Skeletal Warriors by 2. This is just for the increased damage. On our pants, we're going to be running the aspect of Might. This will give us a 20% damage reduction every time we auto-attack, which is virtually all the time. And then on our boots, we're going to be running the Viscous aspect, which will give us 2 additional Skeletal Mages. Each of those additional Skeletal Mages will cast more Blizzards and just auto-attack more, doing way more damage. On our necklace, we're going to be running Disobedience. Even though this was nerfed really heavily, it's still going to be the best defensive aspect by far. On our rings, we're still going to be running the aspect of Reanimation. But on our other ring, we're going to be wanting to switch to the Osseous Gale aspect. The Osseous Gale aspect will significantly increase the uptime on Bone Storm, as it will eat corpses to increase its duration up to 10 seconds. This was buffed as well, so the uptime on this is now much higher than it used to be. So why do we care so much about Bone Storm? Well, The Bone Storm is going to be constantly proccing our Shadow Blight, and then it's also going to be therefore proccing the aspect that we're putting on our weapon, which is the Blighted aspect, which will give us increased damage after we proc Shadow Blight 10 times. And because we're able to turn our Bone Storm into a Shadow skill using the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which we're running on our gloves, you can start to see how this works. So we pop Bone Storm, we're turning Bone Storm into a Shadow skill using the aspect of Ultimate Shadow. Because it's a Shadow skill, it's proccing the Shadow Blight, and then the Shadow Blight, after proccing 10 times, will proc the Blighted aspect, which will give us 240% damage on our two-handed weapon. Then we're increasing the duration of Bone Storm by up to 10 seconds using the Osseous Gale aspect on our ring. So that's like kind of the core bread and butter of our defense and offense of this build. It's where a lot of our damage and a lot of our survivability is coming from. You can start to see how powerful this build is in the mid game when you're reading through these aspects. So many of these slots are dedicated to significant damage increases, and when all multiplied together, the damage output of this build gets crazy. Yet it's still able to be significantly tankier than other builds because of its access to Bone Storm and crazy uptime with Bone Storm. Next, let's cover what is arguably the most important part of the build, which is our minions. For our skeletal warriors, we're going to be running Reapers with the upgrade that causes them to spawn corpses. These corpses are core to the engine that drives this build, as they're going to give us a significant amount of utility and defensive tankiness. For our mages, it gets a little bit more complicated. In general, you're going to be defaulting to Shadow Mages with the extra attack on every 4 attacks. However, when you get the Coldbringers aspect that causes them to cast Blizzards, you have to play the Cold Skeletal Mage. When this happens, we're going to be running the upgrade that causes the mages to apply Vulnerable. For our Golem, we're going to be running Iron Golem, and specifically the one that allows us to apply Vulnerable. Between Corpse Tendrils and this Iron Golem active, our uptime on Vulnerable should be over 80%, which gives us a load of damage. I think at this point we've put it off long enough. Let's dive into the Malignant Hearts and talk about what about those new seasonal mechanics makes this build so insane. Just to quickly go over what Malignant Hearts are for those of you who aren't familiar. Basically, it's the new seasonal mechanic where you fight a big boss, you kill him, and you get a unique gem that you can put into your jewelry that will significantly increase your damage, tankiness, or utility. It's basically another legendary aspect slot with new legendary aspects that weren't in the game before. Let's start with what is the most powerful heart, arguably in the entire game, but definitely the best one for Necromancer, the Great Feast. This will cause our minions to constantly drain essence from us, but these minions will deal an additional 75% damage. That is insane. One thing that isn't entirely clear with this effect is whether or not being at 0 essence turns off the effect. This will actually have a big impact on how we play with this power, but currently the way it's reading, it should work all the time, even if you're out of essence. This next power actually changes so much about the build. If we end up running it, I'm going to have to post an updated build guide because it's going to completely change our skill loadout. It is the Decrepit Aura. When at least 5 enemies are near you, you gain an aura that automatically curses surrounding enemies with Decrepify for 5 to 15 seconds. Now, this sounds pretty strong, but why is it so insane? Well, there's a decent chance that with this power, we're going to be able to take Decrepify off of our bar, and we will be able to replace it with something extremely powerful like Blood Mist, which means our build will have access to an immunity and Unstoppable. This power, I think exactly how it works, could potentially make or break this build when you're talking about the hyper endgame. The Sacrilegious is a heart that is guaranteed to be good no matter what. This is a power that automatically casts corpse skills whenever you're near a corpse, and this happens once a second. Our only corpse skill is Corpse Tendrils, which means as long as we're near a corpse, this is going to be automatically casting Corpse Tendrils all the time. Keep in mind, this one specifically states that it only casts equipped corpse skills, whereas the aura does not state that. So this effect will actually have to keep Corpse Tendrils on our bar, but it's still really strong because it gives us 100% uptime on Vulnerable. There's quite a few other hearts that have potential, but the final one I want to talk about is Revenge. Revenge is a heart that every class has access to, and it has a lot of potential to be played in many builds, especially when you're talking about the end game. But even when leveling, this aspect seems very powerful. The most powerful part of it is the 20% damage absorb that it gives you. So 20% of incoming damage, it just absorbs. The second part of it is quite interesting. It's not exactly clear how strong it is, but Basically, that absorbed damage is stored, and then it gets amplified, and then the amplified explodes and does damage to nearby enemies. We'll see how good the secondary effect is, but the 20% absorb is good enough reason to run it as is. The last major section of the build that we're going to talk about is the Paragon board. Now, this is a early game build guide, so we're not going to get too deep into it. But to start, the very first board that you're going to want to go for is the Cult Leader board. This is going to give you a 45% damage multiplier to your minions. It's absolutely crazy. You need to rush to that legendary node as fast as possible. On this board, we're also going to get access to a couple of very important nodes. They give our minions a lot of damage and tankiness. Specifically, we're going to be looking to get to that glyph slot and put the glyph Dead Razor into it, which will give our minions loads of tankiness, a decent amount of damage, and then the rare nodes and magic nodes around that are crazy strong. Overall, Minions is going to be very powerful in Season 1, and it's definitely a build to have on your radar. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Feel free to drop a like or a sub if you did, and I'll see you guys in the next one.